Okay, today we continue on to chapter 13, the book of Romans. Now, this chapter is going to teach us about the Christian and civil government. Now, there's a reason why he has brought this up. But first of all, let us remember how the book of Romans is broken down. The first 11 chapters would be your doctrinal section. And then starting in chapter 12 through the end of the book, it's what's called practical living, or the practical section of here's what you do. Now, chapter 12 of the book of Romans is a unique chapter because it gives us about 25 things, just bang, 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 that we are either to do or not to do. And each one of these things is something that just goes to the very core of Christianity. So we took plenty of time and we looked at them one by one. Now, the last thing that he talks about in chapter 12 was don't take vengeance. Now, that is a very core problem with every human being. That's something that every parent, one of the first things they have to teach their little children. Even while a little child is crawling on the floor, if another baby reaches over and picks up the toy, why, then they start in, wham. And as soon as they get old enough, why, they'll go over and pull the toy away and slap the other kid, and they're going to protect that. And so we have to teach the children then, don't take vengeance. And it's hard to do because the child will come back and say, but they did it first. But they did it first. They took my toy. They hit me. And how long does that go on? Now, let's be truthful in life. How long does it go on that young people say to parents, but they did it to me first? In other words, do we have our children taught by age 6? It doesn't even start to be. Well, what about by age 16? Well, it doesn't even start to be. Now, here's the kicker. What about by age 60? Have we conquered this? When somebody does something evil to us that we have it under control and we don't have that feeling of vengeance, well, I'm going to get you. It is something that just normally stays with an individual all of their life. And so what we have to do is learn how to control it. We don't learn how to get rid of it. Never. Will you ever be able to get rid of the idea that when somebody does something evil to you, that it doesn't even cross your mind? You are so pure that it doesn't cross your mind to get back at them. That never happens. That's part of being a human being. The whole key is the way we live as a Christian is learning how to overcome these basic desires that we have. And so we have to learn how to conquer that and how to control that. Now, that's what Paul talked about in the 12th chapter. And he just gave us a very basic statement. He said, don't do it. Do you remember why he said don't do it? He only gave us really one reason that I know of. Don't do it. Don't pay anybody back. Don't take vengeance. And he only gave us one reason that I know of. You remember what that reason was? Vengeance belongeth unto God. God will take care of it. Now, this raises another problem. Have you ever prayed to God about anything and God didn't do anything about it for 3 days and you came to the conclusion He's not hearing your prayer? That he evidently is not hearing my prayer. When you pray to God and when you leave things up to God, what is another human weakness? What's another problem that we have to fight all the days of our life? When I ask God to give me something, what do I automatically mean? Lord, give me health, or give me, what is it, Mitch? Now. Well, within 24 hours. I mean, I'm pretty lenient out there. Even 2 days I would accept, you see. Well, what about if the Lord doesn't answer me in 6 months or a year? Have we developed to the point, have we grown, are we mature enough that I could come up to you and say, now, what is one of the big things that you've been praying about? And you say, Lowell, I fervently want this for, let's say, my child. And I prayed to God. And I've been praying to God for 6 months, but evidently God doesn't care or God doesn't hear. Isn't that a weakness that we've got? Okay. And so we have to learn how to control that. And how hard is it? Well, again, we come back to all of you people that's middle age, over 50. Raise your hand if you have it under control and you say, no problem with me. And you look at it and you say, no, it's something that I have to continuously fight. Of course, this brings us back to Abraham, and this is something that I can't comprehend. And that is, how long did Abraham have to wait to get that child after God told him he was going to have a child? You remember? 25 years he had to wait. And he was 75 when God gave him the promise. 75. Now, how many times do you suppose in the next 25 years that it entered Abraham's mind, maybe I misunderstood. Maybe God didn't, you see, think about that for the next 25 years. Well, it did enter his mind. We know that. We know that because one time Abraham, it came to him and he said, I think you understand. I think my little nephew, God meant that I was going to adopt him and he would inherit what I've got. And then God said, no, that's not what I mean. I mean you, Abraham. And then another time, he and Sarah were talking, and Sarah came to an idea. And now then Sarah's getting up there, about 90 years old, never able to bear a child. And she said, Abraham, I think probably what God meant was you would have a child, but he didn't say anything about me. So why don't you take my handmaid, Hagar, go into her and raise a child? Did Abraham say, no way, Sarah, no, sir, we're going to do this right. You're going to have my baby. Did he say that? No? You're probably right. You're probably right. Now, you think about that, and you got to take a long time to see what Abraham went through. And then finally God came back and said, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about you and Sarah going to have a child. And now she's up 90 years old. Now, stop to think. Do we have that kind of faith and that kind of confidence in praying to God? After you've prayed for 2 years about something for your children, generally we all have great concerns about them. Have you ever prayed for 2 years and then you begin to think, no, maybe God's not answering my prayer? See? Well, this is where we come into vengeance. We come back. And God just barely makes a statement to you and me like he did to Abraham. He didn't explain it to Abraham. He didn't say, Abraham, now through thy seed. Now, Abraham, I want to explain that because that's kind of an unusual thing. Now, through thy seed shall all nations be blessed. Now, what I'm talking about is, I'm talking about the Christ. I'm talking about you having a baby, Abraham. But now you're not going to have one for 25 years, and I know that it will bother you, and I know that it'll just drive you crazy. But did God tell Abraham, did he explain all of it that way? No. He just said, through thy seed, all nations be blessed. Now, he's told us that very thing. Don't take vengeance, because vengeance belongeth unto me. He said, I will recompense. God said, I'll take care of that. Just like I'll take care of the baby. So now, stop to think, do we have it conquered? See? Nope, we don't. Now, here's something else that God did. In chapter 12, that's all God said. But in chapter 13, God now is going to give us a little more explanation on that. He's going to describe it a little bit more. And God's going to say, now here's one way in which I've already taken action and I've done something so that vengeance will be taken. And God said, I've set up civil government. So that's why he's teaching about civil government. Because civil government is a minister of God for a particular reason. Last week we talked about God started the family, God started the church or the kingdom, and each one has a purpose, and God started civil government. And then he tells us in chapter 13 what the job of civil government is. Family, we know what the job is. The church, the kingdom, we know what the job is. It's not to take vengeance in there. The Lord said, my kingdom is not of this world, and if it were of this world, why, we would fight and so forth. But so it's not to do that. But God said, now, I've set up civil government. Then he said, for rulers are not a terror to the good work, but to the evil, and it is a minister of God. Now, I want to go over that one more time so we'll understand, because in our English translations, most of the time it says, for he is a minister of God. And we get the idea that it's talking about some particular man. But no, in the Greek of which Paul was writing, the word, the pronoun, he, she, and it is all the same thing. It's just one thing. And you take the context and see what it's talking about. If you said, I was talking to a woman the other day, and then use this word, then you say, and she told me. If you're talking about a man, you'd say, he told me. But if I said I went out to get in my car this morning, and she wouldn't start, you'd say, no. Well, he wouldn't start. No, it wouldn't start. That's the way they used it. So it's very simple. There's no mix-up about it at all. And this word right in here, so put in, he's a minister of God. That's civil government. It is a minister of God. Now that really changes things in our mind. Really does. I'm taking a little extra time today to talk about this, because as we're looking here at the book of Romans, we talk about the practical section. We're talking about things that actually affect us in everyday life. We're not talking about philosophy. We're not talking about what ifs and we get out there in the philosophical realm. How many of you are related in some way or another to civil government? In other words, you drive a car and so you have to obey the traffic laws. Or you got a house and you have to pay taxes. Or is there anybody not under civil government? See? Now, when you're under civil government, do you ever get irritated at them? Do you ever just want to... Yeah, you do. See, you do. But that's why this chapter is so important. Now, what he's telling us is that here, civil government is an instrument of God. He's going to call it a minister of God to thee for good. So now that changes things. Next time you're driving along and you hear that siren behind you, and you pull over to the side of the road, instead of you thinking that dirty, no good, low down in here, you think that is God's servant. That's the government, that's the minister of God. And what he's going to do is he's going to do good to me if I was keeping all the laws. But if I were breaking the law, what does this say he's going to do to me? He's going to punish me, see? But that's God's servant punishing me. Do we ever think that way? I mean, is that the way we really think? See, what I'm trying to do today is to get us to try to take control of our mind so that we think like Christ thinks. And when we really take time to look at some of these things, we say, that's not the way I think about it. See, that really is not the way that I think about it. Well, that's why he has put this in there, for us to take control of this and do what he tells us to do. So now then, we have the civil government here. Now here's some words that we need to define, and this is where we pick up our story from last week. We look at it here and we see such words as these, and we got down to this far anyway. Now, as he starts out here, the word subjection means to arrange under or obey. The word for power means authority. There are no authorities but of God. The word ordained means something that has been arranged or placed in order. When a little while people bring out the bread and the fruit of the vine, and they will arrange it that's in here. Well, we don't use the word ordained this way, but I could say, okay, now they have ordained the bread and the fruit of the vine, and you would know what I mean. It has been placed in order. See? Right now, it's in a back room. Now, we don't use it when we're talking about things like this, but we use it generally when we're talking about people. The people have been ordained. Well, what does that mean? It means they've been placed in a certain position. That's all it means. See? I could ask Riley here, say, Riley, I would like for you to do this for me. Would you take this responsibility? And Riley says, yes, I will. Now, I could say he's my ordained servant. See, Riley has been ordained. Why? Because I've placed him in order, at a position. Now, God has done that with civil government. He has ordained civil government. He has placed civil government in there. Now, he that resisteth, that word means to oppose or resist, stand up, and go into rebellion. Now, when you resist civil government, you are resisting the ordinance of God. The word for ordinance there means a disposition, arrangement, or an ordinance. Another word, the way we call them, is laws. If you go down to the city hall, you say, I want to build another room on my house. May I do that? Well, you're asking them, what does the law say? But they'll come back and they'll say, okay, now, under Ordinance 5687, it says, well, what do they mean by Ordinance 5687? It means under this law that we have set in place. So now when we rebel then, we are rebelling against the ordinance or the law of God. Now when we do that, then it says we will receive judgment. Judgment means a condemnation of doing wrong, a sentence of God, that. Now here's an interesting thing. We all get discouraged and disgusted at government. Is there ever a legitimate reason to get disgusted at government? In other words, when you've got some people in there that are crooked and ungodly and liars and cheats and they're caught in doing it, is that a disgusting thing? Yeah, that's a very disgusting thing. Now, is that God's fault? No, that's not God's fault. No, that's not God's fault. God didn't make that person disgusted. That person disgusting. That person is in there to do us a service. He's in there to help us, and now then he's in there cheating us. Yeah, we would get disgusted at that particular individual when he's doing these things. But that doesn't mean that government is rotten. Now, we want government to do justice, don't we? Isn't this one of the big problems that we think about? One of the problems that we think about in our government today is that justice is not always served. I think, no, there are just a certain amount of judges today that they have a certain agenda, and it's not based on judges and justice. Now, is that God's plan to have judges who don't render just judgment? No. That's disobedient individuals. Disobedient individuals. Now, you take a guy like me who is a perfect husband. Helen has no complaints. But let's take Mitch. Now, does Melissa have any complaints? Oh boy, see? Oh boy, you can just hear it. You see the cheer. So now we take him over here. Here she has a whole sheet of things that Mitch needs to change. So now I get up and I start preaching. Husband and wife relationship, family relationships are no good. They're no good. Why? Because Mitch did something the other day he shouldn't have done. See? That's the reason. What would you say to me? See? You say, Lowell, you lost your mind. See? You've lost your mind. Now that's the way it is with civil government. Yep, judges do things that are wrong. But we want them to offer fair judgment. Now there's only one exception I know to that. There's only one time when I really don't want them to offer fair, just judgment. You know when that is? Yeah, Steve does because he's got a big grin on his face. It's when I'm in the wrong. So the traffic policeman pulls me over. I'm going 10 miles over the limit. He comes up and says, Mr. Williams, and I can see him. What do I hope he'll do? Oh, sir, oh, see. Now, if there's a car that just passed me, zing, going 10 miles over, and a policeman pulled him over, what do I hope he'll do? Sock it to him. Do what God wants. Punish him. But when he pulls me over, here's the whole point I'm getting at. Do you think we have any growth? Is there any room for growth for Mitch and me to say, yeah, we need to, we need to grow. We need to get control of things. And the reason I'm taking this time this morning is just to show us that in everyday life, every time you pull out on the street, in everyday life, we have a relationship, and most of us don't know how to handle it. We forget it. See, we forget it. I want mercy, but I want the judge to sock it to you. And so what he says here is we must understand if we do wrong, then the judge is to offer this just judgment. Now, this government, is a minister of God. I think this is interesting. The word for minister in the Greek language means raising dust by hastening, raising dust by running. That's what it means. I tell Riley, go out to my car and get me something. So Riley gets up and he goes, okay. What am I going to say to him about the time he gets to the door? Riley, kick up the dust, buddy. Start running. Now, that's the word for minister here. What kind of minister do we want? What kind of servant do we want? We want a servant of God. God says, I put him in the service as a minister, and I expect him to kick up the dust. Isn't that graphic to you? It is to me. I expect them to serve justice. I expect them to do their job with enthusiasm and with zeal. Do what they should do. I want that except when he pulls me over, see? But that's what he is, the minister. Minister of God is one that does that, that's there. So it's one who executes the commands of another. It's a servant or it is a minister. And that's what he is. Now, it gets down and tells us now what we're to do with him, and that is where we're to pay our taxes. But before we do that, I want us to go back now, and since we've identified these words, let us read about this. And let's come down now, since we know the definition of these words. Let every soul, every person, be in subjection or obedience to the higher powers or authorities. For there is no power or authority or government but of God. And the powers or authorities that are in office are ordained of God. God has set them in office. Therefore, he that resisteth, rebels against the power, withstandeth or resisteth the ordinance of God. So when we rebel against government, we're not just rebelling against some man, we're rebelling against the ordinance of God. And they that withstand shall receive to themselves judgment. So we're not just rebelling against a human, but we're rebelling against the ordinance of God, and we will receive the condemnation that is just. For rulers are a terror, the rulers are not a terror to the good work, but to the evil. So if we do good, our rulers, our policemen, don't scare us. But if we are not doing good, if we're breaking the speed limit, they do scare us. I shouldn't take the time to tell this. I ought to tell you something about Linda. I'm going to take the time to show you what this does. This is worth $1 million. It's going to take a long story, so get ready. One time Linda was going home. She gets out of Gold Bar, and you know that you get out there, and there's a place you come up, and then right before you get to the campground, you turn to the left. It's a 90 degree to the left. Well, she's coming along there in, I don't know, a 25-mile-an-hour speed zone going 30 miles an hour. And she gets up this corner, and she looks up there, and there's a policeman up there with his radar on. So she sees a policeman. She turns the corner. He just sits there. She drives down 100 yards or so till she can get a wide spot in the road, and she pulls over. And she just sits there. And the policeman just sits there. And Linda just sits there. And the policeman just sits there. And Linda just sits there. And it gets ridiculous. So finally the policeman thinks maybe she has a heart attack or she has something. And he pulls around the corner and pulls up behind her, and he comes up and he said, "Lady, do you have a problem?" And she said, "No. No." "Well, what are you doing?" "Well, I'm waiting on you." "Well, what's your problem?" "Well," she said, I was coming down that road, and I saw you up there, and I looked at, and I was going 5 miles over the speed limit. So I just pulled over waiting on you to come and give me a ticket." And he looked at her, and, "Are you all right?" And I think he asked her a question about drinking or something. And finally he said, "Lady, you go on home and have a good day." So she went on home. Now, one thing you got to say about Linda, did she have respect for civil government? Yep, she had respect for civil government. And another thing you have to say, does she have a terror for evil works? See, when she was going 5 miles over, she said, "Oh, that's wrong, and so I'm going to pull over so he can give me a ticket." You see, I think that story is worth $1 million. And it illustrates in here, I think, an exaggerated case of this terror for good works. Now, if you do good, then you're going to have praise from the same. For he or it is a minister of God to thee for good. That's why God has government, is for our good. "And if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain." In other words, the government is given the power to use the sword. Now, when you start using the sword, what's he talking about here? Is he talking about trimming toenails? No, he's talking about cutting off heads. He's talking about exerting power, punishment. Now, the government doesn't have this power in vain. There's a reason they have it. There's a reason they can put people to death, and that is to do what God would have them to do. So he says in verse 4, "But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he," or it, the government, "is a minister of God, an avenger for wrath to him that doeth evil." Now he's come down to identify it. Remember in chapter 12 he says, don't you become an avenger. Don't you take vengeance. You leave vengeance to God. Now Paul is describing God has set up civil government to take vengeance. That's where you go to take vengeance, and you can let the judge make the determination, let civil government make the determination of what kind of punishment there should be when somebody does something to you in that way. Then he says in verse 5, "Wherefore ye must needs be in subjection," so you be obedient, "not only because of the wrath," so now don't just obey because you know that you're going to receive the wrath of the civil government, but also for conscience sake. Now, we got to understand here that it's also for conscience sake. That I will obey the laws, not just because I'm afraid of a policeman getting me, but because of conscience sake. Because I know that God has set up civil government, and if I disobey and rebel, I'm disobeying against the laws of God. And that ought to bother my conscience. That ought to keep me doing what I need to do, whether there's a policeman around or whether he's not around. That I'll not try to subvert those particular laws. So Paul then is telling us this, and I think that it's really, really valuable for us to stop and just meditate, and I know I've repeated, just stop and meditate and think about, these are things I live with every day of my life. Every morning when I get up out of bed, start out my day, I live with these things. Do I have my mind like the mind of Christ? That's the big key. Now, there's where we're going to stop for today. Next week, we're going to get into something that's pretty relevant this time of the year. It's paying taxes. And so we'll talk about that. Okay, class dismissed.